Stand-up comedy is the personification of science.
Thank you. Good night. My name is Harold Bay.
Hello, my name is Dr. Harold Bays, Medical Director and President of the Louisville Metabolic and Atherosclerosis Research Center, located in Louisville, Kentucky. Welcome to this series of YouTube videos entitled The Science of Standup. This YouTube video will examine free speech and cancel culture. This YouTube video is one in a series of YouTube presentations examining the science of stand-up as it is integrated with other sciences. We've already discussed the science of stand-up as it relates to theoretical physics and the literary arts, as well as the sciences of psychiatry and the sciences of psychology. We've also talked about racism. And in the following presentation, we will be talking about forgiveness. So this presentation on free speech and cancel culture, along with racism and forgiveness, will be all about the social sciences. I can think of no more timely topic than the topic of cancel culture. At the time of this taping in 2021, it is a matter of great concern to a lot of folks. And so we're going to examine what is cancel culture and what does it mean to stand up comedy? So let's start with a basic question to lead in to this discussion. Which represents the most favorable outcome regarding a disagreement? Should you cancel the opposing point of view, or should you engage with the opposing viewpoint? Should you suppress expression of an opposing viewpoint, providing no additional insight to either side? Or is it better to examine the basis of an opposing viewpoint, which may provide additional insights to both sides? And I think that's the essential dilemma for which we are currently in 2021. So let's get right to it. What is a boycott and what is cancel culture? Boycott can be defined as individuals who collectively abstain from social and financial transactions with individuals or companies with whom they disagree. What is cancel culture? Cancel culture is a philosophical approach of individuals who ostracize and seek to professionally, economically, and personally harm individuals or companies with whom they disagree, or those who associate with those they disagree. Now, what is, I think, very curious, and I think historians will look back on in wonderment, is the fact that this assault to free speech, this boycotting, this cancel culture and such of free speech, seems to disproportionately occur on college campuses. Here we have a free speech college survey where college students were surveyed to determine the degree by which they felt their college or their university allowed free speech. So there's a couple things to say here. First off, why would we even have to conduct such a survey? It would seem to me that it's a given that especially in college or universities, I mean, that should be the pinnacle of free speech. There should be no question about that. There should be no need for a survey. But the fact that a survey was done and the fact that results are known, I think says a lot about where we are in 2021. So according to this survey, the best universities for encouraging critical thinking and expression were the University of Chicago, Purdue, Princeton, and the University of Virginia. And surprisingly, at least to me, is that some of the worst schools with regard to engaging in free speech were many of the Ivy League schools. I find that to be very curious. So when did cancel culture and boycotts begin? Some people believe that it is a recent phenomenon, but it is not. The fact is, cancel culture and boycotts have been around since forever, and certainly since the birth of the United States. So let's just talk about the origin of the terms. In 1800s, Charles Boycott, and yes, there was a person named Boycott. Okay, that's where you get the name, Boycott. Charles Boycott was a land manager for Englishmen who, after a bad harvest, at the instruction of the Earl of Erne, refused to lower rent to the tenants by 25%. And these Irish folks who had just had a really bad harvest were upset. They're like, look, we don't really have the money to pay it this time. Could you give us a break? And he said no, because that was the instructions of the Earl of Erne. So subsequently, these Irish folks said, well, fine, we're just going to shun Boycott, and we're not going to sell him anything. And ultimately, he was forced to leave Dublin. He was essentially canceled. He was boycotted. 1700s, Stamp Act. England passed taxes on sugar, goods, and stamps to fund the cost of English soldiers in the American colonies. The colonists protested. They said taxation without representation, and they refused to purchase British goods. So they essentially were boycotting British goods and threatened tax inspectors. The Stamp Act was successfully repealed or canceled. 1955, Jim Crow laws. Black leaders called for a boycott of city buses in Montgomery, Alabama, due to racial segregation, what was called Jim Crow laws. Once the Supreme Court ruled that transport segregation was unconstitutional, unlawful, then segregation on buses was successfully canceled. So here are examples of boycotts and cancel culture that were an integral part of history. And then we have the 1773 Boston Tea Party. So here we had these ships that were carrying carrying tea that was being sold or carried by the East India Company. All right, so this East India Company tea was sent to the colonies of what would eventually become the United States. And the colonists opposed the import of this tea because the British were subsidizing it. And so there are all kinds of claims of government-created East India Company monopoly on tea distribution. So in New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, protesters successfully caused tea consignees to resign. So they were canceled. Okay, so that solved the problem there, but in Boston, not so much. So the way that they canceled these tea shipments was not by causing the tea consignees to resign, but instead about 100 men from Boston all got on the East India Company ships, and they just started throwing the tea overboard. They tossed 342 chests of tea overboard, which in today's money was millions of dollars. And this was called the Boston Tea Party. So Samuel Adams, a patriot, characterized the protest as a principled protest and not the act of a lawless mob. I mean, I think that just brings to mind, who makes that decision? Who makes that distinction when something is a principled protest versus an act of a lawless mob? And to be clear, in this case, 342 chests of tea were thrown overboard, costing this company millions of dollars. Okay? And at the end of the day, some people believe this was a significant promoter or facilitator of the American Revolution. So what about other examples of boycotts or cancel culture? Well, as individuals, we sort of do this all the time. If you take your car to a car dealership, and they treat you or your family very poorly, then you don't go back, right? You're boycotting them on a personal level. if you shop online, and if much of your shopping is based upon how many stars that a particular product gets, well, if you're only buying the ones with the 4 or 5 stars and you're not buying the ones with the 1 star, then those have been successfully boycotted. They're not being purchased. And then there have been times where the United States has boycotted the Olympics. So why does cancel culture seem to be increasing, and why is it such a big deal now? Well, I think a large part of it has to do with the expansion of social media. We have so much internet documentation of people either doing misdeeds or just making mistakes. These were things that either we wouldn't have believed before, we would have thought perhaps were exaggerated, or maybe people just never even saw them. And there would have been no way to get mass recognition or mass accountability for people who either committed misdeeds or for people who made mistakes. And I think it's fair to say that one person's lament of cancel culture is another person's appreciation for accountability. So I think we need to be very careful that when we talk about cancel culture, that we know what we're talking about. Because many of these folks that are engaged in cancel culture do have a desire for positive change, and they are frustrated about the relative lack of social advancement that we've had for the past 70 years. Another factor, and I could be wrong on this, is the lack of war. Okay, I think an issue that we have is war used to be a way to get politicians to improve their approval ratings, but over the past decades, that's just not a viable option anymore. And I don't think we go into war for the purpose of raising approval ratings much anymore, because it just hasn't worked out like I think it used to. Back when we had World War II and such, and World War I, I mean, we had a defined evil person or a defined antagonist, and then we would win the war, and people would feel good about the fact that we won the war. But then we got into the Vietnam War, which was just a quagmire. Nobody really knew why we were in the war. We didn't know what the end game was, and there were all kinds of protests, and the country turned against the war, and it was just a mess. At least to me, I think it's one of the darkest periods in the United States for which I've been around. We had post-war social unrest, we had gas lines, we had inflation, interest rates up to 20%, and then there was the Iranian hostage crisis. And these were all post-war issues that came up, which on the heels of the Vietnam War, people just felt awful about themselves and awful about the country. Then in the 1980s, we had a new type of war. It was the Cold War. It was against the Soviet Union, which was thought to be evil. And while this wasn't a hot war in the sense that there was physical violence, it certainly was a Cold War. And through political manipulations and such, ultimately the United States won the Cold War, and the Soviet Union was no more and became Russia, as well as other countries. So there was dissolution of the Soviet Union. There was even tearing down of the Berlin Wall, which is just a landmark event. And people were generally happy in the 1980s. There was a song that typified this, "Don't Worry, Be Happy," by Bobby McFerrin. If you look at all the music that came out then and the music videos, it was a very positive time. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand we had problems in the 80s. I understand there were underlying issues. I get all that. But folks, sometimes it's okay to say that there was some degree of happiness at periods of our country's history. I think it's okay to acknowledge that, okay? And then we got to the 1990s. We got engaged in the Persian Gulf War because Iraq had invaded Kuwait. And President George H.W. Bush approval rating went to 90%. So you might say, well, there's an example where getting into a war really improved the approval rating of the president. Now, I'm not saying that President Bush got us into the war to improve his ratings. Approval ratings. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that it did However, the lesson was that he lost re-election a year later. How's that possible? It's because people said, on the short term, we're going to support this country. But on the longer term, we want to focus on the country, right? We want to focus on fixing things and making things better for everyone. Subsequent to that, there was the Rodney King beating, the O.J. Simpson trial and whatever. And I can't say people were overly happy at that time. And then in 2003, George Bush Jr., the President George Bush Jr., engaged in the second Persian Gulf War. And there, Iraq had failed to comply with UN weapons inspections. And there were all kinds of accusations of weapons of mass destruction. Problem is, after the war was over, couldn't find any weapons of mass destruction. So you can imagine how that went over. You know, there wasn't any post-war glow that was going on. And if you want to get some sense about how people are feeling about things, there's two songs I would point to, both by Norah Jones, My Dear Country, and another one, Sinking Soon. And I think both those songs sort of typified how people felt about the country at that time. So people had immediate second thoughts about this war and such. And then we had Barack Obama, who was elected in 2009, 2017. In 2017, we had President Donald Trump elected. But then we had like the COVID-19 pandemic, and 2020, George Floyd, black man, was murdered by police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And Donald Trump loses the election, his re-election in 2020. And during all of this time, it seemed like cancel culture was escalating. But as you can see here, we've gone a while without a war. And so people were, again, focused on trying to fix things internally. And it appears that we have reached the point, and I sort of hope this is true, where I think the politicians recognize that getting engaged in a war is no guarantee of long-term increase in approval ratings. Okay? So here's the University of Chicago and their policies on free expression. You may recall from the survey I talked about that that University of Chicago is one of the highest rated colleges with regard to free speech among college students. And what was the philosophy behind the Chicago principles? You know, that's what they call it. Well, at least what they say is through the Broyles Bill and McCarthyism. Now, McCarthyism, you may recall that in a prior video regarding Hazel Scott, there was this time where all these people were being accused of being communist sympathizers and such, with very little evidence to support it. And people were wrongfully canceled, including Hazel Scott. So again, the YouTube video on racism has an extensive discussion of this. And then there were also the Vietnam protests and the Cold War and all of these things, you know, these war-related things. And as a result, the university leaders and the faculty and the students and the staff, they said, we need to join together and uphold the principles of free expression and academic freedom. So in 2014, the president at the time said the university's overarching commitment to free, robust, and uninhibited debate represented the philosophy, the Chicago principles of the University of Chicago. And there have been universities and colleges who have adopted these principles since. And why is this important? Why is it important that we have free, robust, and uninhibited debate? What's the advantage? Well, the first thing is, if you do have a libertarian mindset, I mean, that's just the way you think. Libertarians may not necessarily support or even to listen to other people's points of view. However, libertarians oppose authoritarian suppression of individual freedoms of expression as long as it does not harm or suppress the liberties of others. Because I think that's the only way that you advance a society. I think that's the only way that you advance a society is by hearing multiple points of view. And that, I think that allows you to come to a more rational conclusion about the best path forward. And here's just a sort of a metaphor that I think is applicable here. Turbulent winds cause trees to grow with a stronger foundation. For example, if you grow a tree in a biosphere, it'll grow, but ultimately it'll just fall over and die. Because the roots, it'll have very weak roots. Okay? So turbulent winds cause trees to grow with a stronger root foundation. When wind is suppressed, trees collapse before they mature. If you want a tree to grow, mature, and be healthy enough to survive the real world, then you cannot cancel the wind. And I think that's a good metaphor for where we are today. So let's take some examples. In the 2020s, there was kneeling on the part of National Football League players during the national anthem. And they said they were doing so because they were protesting against acts of police brutality against blacks. So they kneeled during the national anthem. Well, there are a lot of folks that took this to mean that these NFL football players were protesting against the military. A lot of people say, well, that's ridiculous. It's not what they meant at all. But folks, the national anthem, the lyrics, they had things like perilous fight and rockets red glare, and bombs bursting in air. Many times after the national anthem, you would have military fighter jets flying over football stadiums. So I think it's not unreasonable that people might have misinterpreted the protest and might have thought the NFL players were protesting against the military. Also, it should be noted that the national anthem was created during the War of 1812, subsequently became the national anthem, and it was adopted as an anthem to Union soldiers, sort of a symbol of national unity in combating slavery. So all things considered, I'm just not sure that protesting during the national anthem was the best timing. Okay, the best timing. Subsequently, you had viewers that boycotted the NFL, and the NFL ratings, viewership ratings declined. Now let's be clear. Nobody's suggesting that either party didn't have a right to do what they did. With regard to the NFL football players, as long as NFL team owners, the employers, permitted the protests, then the players had a right to kneel. I don't think anybody's denying that. Conversely, as long as viewers were offended by the kneeling, then viewers had a right not to watch. So what lessons could the NFL football players have learned from the science of stand-up? Well, the science of stand-up tells us that targeting and timing, critical. It's critical to successful comedy, is targeting and timing. You got to target the joke, and you got to have impeccable timing. Well, I mean, here's just a small suggestion. What would have happened if the NFL players had stood up during the national anthem and been respectful during the national anthem, but then after the national anthem took a knee? As a symbolic protest, taking a knee after the national anthem had finished. And then they could have made the case that we're not protesting against the military. In fact, what we're protesting is the betrayal of the sacrifices by the military by police brutality against blacks. Because protecting freedom is what so many people lost their lives. Was the reason for the loss of lives of so many people in the military. Well, it seems to me that would have been a clearer message and better timing. Also, what was the goal? What was the ultimate endpoint of the kneeling during the national anthem? Well, in medicine, medical sciences, we have goal setting, and a acronym we often use is the SMART method of goal setting, where we are specific about the goal. We choose goals that are measurable, that are achievable, that are relevant, and then we put some sort of time on when these goals are to be achieved. Now, maybe the NFL football players did this. Maybe they were specific about what they were protesting, but I'm not exactly sure what the end point was going to be. What was going to be measured to determine the success of their protest? What were they hoping to achieve? And how was that relevant to protest during the national anthem? And what was the time, what was the time period for which the NFL football players hoped to get something accomplished? This goes back to the metrics that I discussed on the racism YouTube video. Here are 6 metrics with regard to disparities, particularly among blacks: safety, life expectancy, family structure, education, income, and incarceration. Now, these aren't the 6 most important things, but I think they're all pretty important. What aspect of the kneeling by NFL football players was going to improve any of these things? So yet again, I think it goes back to the goal setting and your target, and just being smart about what it is you're wanting to achieve. Because an objective without a plan, just a wish, right? Solutions are hard, but they're not complicated. Where are the evidence-based solutions, and how come we're not hearing protests about the lack of implementing evidence-based solutions? So I think it just comes down to this. Whenever you have folks that are protesting or boycotting or engaged in cancel culture, I mean, what is your objective? What are you trying to achieve, and how is that a plan? What are the goals? Did you engage in the SMART goal setting? Or is it just a matter of raising awareness? And I'm fine with raising awareness, and I appreciate that. But as I mentioned before in other YouTube videos, folks, at some point we've got to start fixing the problem. And this is me speaking personally, I just wish we would spend as much time talking about fixing the problems and how to fix problems based upon the evidence as we are about raising awareness. Now you might say, well, Dr. Bays, that's an interesting proposition there, but the fact is we will never galvanize this country to unify in such a way that we can come up with these solutions. I mean, it's just not going to happen. The country can never be that unified. It's just the nature of the United States. Folks, that's just wrong. Now here we have a map of the election, 1984 presidential election. And I'm not going to tell you which party won or which president won, because many of you probably not going to know. But as you can see here, the president who got elected won 49 out of 50 states. 49 out of 50 states. That's pretty unified, folks. 49 out of 50 states. So yes, we can be unified. We can. Now again, I'm not saying that the 80s were perfect. I'm not saying that there weren't a lot of serious issues that needed to be addressed at the time, that there weren't a lot of problems, and I get all of those things. But as I mentioned before, sometimes it's okay to acknowledge times in which there's been a positive mood of the country, at least among many folks. Now you might say, well, what does any of this have to do with stand-up comedy? I don't think it's any coincidence that the biggest boom in comedy and comedy clubs was in the 80s. 1980s, that was the boom of the comedy clubs, and in fact, that's when I got started. So look, we cannot do everything at once, but we can do something at once. That was a quote by Calvin Coolidge. I think that's right. The problem is, as I said before, we got folks that believe and are so frustrated that they believe that canceling out the opinions of others is advantageous. And that's especially troubling to me when it comes to college campuses. As I said before, I don't think historians are going to look favorably upon this age. I really don't. Now, I get it. A lot of colleges feel that there are benefits, there are pros to canceling speech and canceling comics on college campuses. And what are these potential advantages? Well, first of all, if diverse viewpoints were permitted on campus, then some students may choose to adopt viewpoints that are inconsistent with the viewpoints of the institution, its faculty, and selected students. And for many folks, they do not want to engage in the marketplace of ideas. That's anathema. Okay. Secondly, disagreeable speech to some folks is triggering and is the very same thing as hate speech. So if a student hears someone with an opposing point of view, and they object to that point of view, then that is defined as hate speech. Hate speech. And finally, there's some that believe that college is a time for teaching. It represents a protected sanctuary to learn principles via the guidance of the college faculty. And it is, essentially not the time to be concerned about opposing points of view. Now, what are the downsides to canceling speakers and canceling comics at university campuses? Well, in the 1700s, there was this advocate of free speech and a crusader against tyranny, bigotry, and cruelty. His name was Voltaire. He's French. And Evelyn Beatrice Hall's interpretation of Voltaire's appeal was, "I disagree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." How many of you people know that quote? I must say, in my lifetime, I used to hear it a lot. Don't hear it so much anymore, because I don't think people believe it anymore. But at one time, this was a pretty common way of thinking when it came to speech. Another potential downside to canceling stand-up comics and canceling speakers on college campuses is that, engaging those with diversity of thought helps students better prepare to defend and implement their principles after college. Like if you haven't been trained to defend your principles during college, what chance do you think you're going to have to defend your principles after you leave college? And that's got to be really tough. If the first time you've been challenged, the first time you've been challenged on your belief is after you leave college, I don't think that's a good plan. And finally, and I find these two to be really tragic, some college students believe they are graded by their professors based upon their political ideology, and some students suppress their beliefs for fear of reprisal from the academic collective mindset. And that, I just think that's wrong, okay? Other more global adverse consequences of cancel culture has to do with the fact that we already know what happens when we engage in such behavior. When we engage in canceling the viewpoints of others simply because we disagree with them, we already know what happens. There was suppression of speech in the 1950s. This is nothing new. It was called McCarthyism. There was the Red Scare and identification of supposed communist sympathizers. And again, I would encourage you to go look at the YouTube video on the Science of Standup and racism. And then there was continued suppression of speech in the 1960s, 1970s, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and songs such as "For Dead in Ohio," where you had college students who were killed during a demonstration against the Vietnam War. And then there was the whole issue of Al Franken. I don't know how many people know Al Franken, but he's a former stand-up comic. Used to be on Saturday Night Live as an actor comedian. But he had been elected to the United States Senate from the state of Minnesota. And in 2017, he resigned due to accusations of sexual impropriety. Now, folks, was he guilty of this? I don't know. I saw some of the videotapes and such. I mean, were they staged? I mean, was there implicit consent for some of the things he did, or was it just poor taste? I mean, I don't really know. But I don't think I saw enough that I agree with the fact that he resigned. Now, let me be clear. If during his tenure there in the Senate, Al Franken said that other people should be resigning if they're being accused of misdeeds, particularly sexual impropriety, and due process doesn't matter. If that's what he said and that was the position he took, well, then it's probably right that he resigned. But if he didn't say that, and he didn't say that people who are accused of sexual impropriety are not entitled to due process, then I don't think he should have resigned. I think that was a bad move, and I think if you were to ask him today, he might agree with you. Because the bottom line is this. Politics is the exaggeration of narrow differences to give people the illusion of choice. And I just think that's just real problematic, because people just pick and choose these hot button issues, maybe the 5 to 10% of the things for which we disagree, and then the other 90% of the things for which we all agree, nothing ever gets done to fix all those things. Like there's 90% of stuff that I think we all can agree needs to be fixed, can be fixed. But if we're so busy talking about the 5 to 10% of things, then we're focused on these narrow differences, nothing gets done. All right, so what is offensive? I've continually talked about people who are offended. We talked in the past about offendophiles. I'm going to talk about that more here in a minute. Well, what is offensive? Well, it used to be what was offensive. If you were to ask somebody what's offensive, they would gravitate towards saying, well, you must mean language, right? You must mean, when you say offensive speech, you must mean the choice of words. I don't find that to be what's on people's minds when it comes to offensiveness anymore, because the particular type of words that people can and cannot say on the TV and the cable and just normal discourse, that has evolved or devolved depending upon your point of view. So I've just listed some of the more legalistic interpretations of obscenity and such, and I've got them written on the slides. So how does this apply to stand-up comedy? Well, obviously, stand-up comics often use blue language, which can be offensive to some folks. The other thing is that, as mentioned in prior YouTube videos, it's simply the science of stand-up that many stand-up comics engage in observational comedy. People love observational comedy. They respond favorably to familiarity. They respond favorably to agreement. And they respond favorably to shared experiences, annoyances, and hypocrisy. Well, right off the bat, you can see, if a comic's going to stand up and talk about shared experiences regarding annoyances and hypocrisy, then they're making fun of somebody, right? Somebody's going to be the butt of the joke. And if you happen to be on that side of the joke, you're probably going to be offended. Because let's just make it as clear as I possibly can. Comedy often highlights differences. That is comedy, right? That's an essential component of stand-up comedy. And I know people say, well, look, other people used to be able to get away with it. You had the court jesters that would be able to tell the king things that nobody else could say. Court jesters, they could make fun of the king in a way nobody else could make fun of the king. And they could say all these things that other people couldn't say. And I don't know, maybe that's true in some cases, but I'll bet if a historian really looked back hard, they would find that there were a lot of jesters who, when they made fun of the king, were beheaded. Okay, that the king goes, that's offensive, I didn't like the joke, off with your head. Okay, I'm guessing that occurred a lot more than people think. All right, so what kind of differences are we talking about when we talk about differences that are exploited by the stand-up comic? Well, they would be differences in demographics or location or characteristics or just other stuff, religion, politics, socioeconomic status, all that kind of stuff. And if you look through this list, you can just see this as a virtual minefield of people being offended. Because if you're going to start talking about differences in any one of these words that are on this page, you have the potential of offending somebody. if they truly want to be offended. Let me give you a practical example. This has been talked about by other comics before. I'm not the first one to come to this conclusion. It's sort of a comedy rule that you can make fun of women. You can have a routine where you make fun of women. It just better be balanced with making fun of men. Okay? There better be some balance there. And you're going to be way better off if you start with the making fun of women and end with making fun of men. That's just kind of the order for which you ought to go. Now, don't get me wrong. Women are good about taking a joke and whatever, but they do want to see balance. Okay? They want to see some balance. And at the end of the day, the women need to win. Okay? It's the women who need to win. Okay. All right. So as much as I'm opposed, and many people are opposed to the cancel culture, that's where we live. So what can we do? Well, first off, I think we can recalibrate and ask ourselves, what's the objective? Is the objective to simply engage in offendophilia regarding disagreements with an individual? Or should our objective be to affect positive systemic change? And I just don't think you can affect positive systemic change if your only focus is on pointing out or calling people out on mistakes that they made, or when they were inarticulate, or maybe they were ignorant, okay, or misinformed or whatever, and your knee-jerk reaction is, we got to get this person fired, or we got to ruin this person's reputation, or we got to hurt them professionally, or we got to hurt them economically. If that's your knee-jerk reaction, rather than trying to affect positive systemic change, I think you've missed out on an opportunity to make a difference. So here are competing approaches when a problem arises. Let's say a problem arises, or somebody does something that could be offended or whatever, or could be offensive or whatever. One approach is to specifically and objectively identify the problem, describe the problem accurately, focus on a solution, and be consistent. You can do that. The alternative is to describe the problem with platitudes and without verification. In other words, no due process. Describe the problem with extreme hyperbole in hopes of personal acknowledgement. I'll talk about that more here in a minute. Focus on the politics and be inconsistent in how you apply your principles. Folks, I don't know. I think the items on the left would seem to be more productive than the approach on the right. So here's just a practical example. How many times have you heard somebody that's opposed to somebody on the left, somebody that people claim to be a liberal, they're a liberal, they're a progressive, they're a liberal. And they'll come up with some outrageous want, some outrageous proposal, say, for example, universal health care. That's just, what a horrible thing to propose. And somebody will say, well, I oppose that point of view, and then they'll want to disagree, but nobody's listening to them. Everybody's going, no, universal health care sounds like a pretty good idea. They're like, well, you're not listening to me. So they get very frustrated. And so what they have found is the only way that they can get people to listen to them, to listen to their point of view, is to engage in the name calling. So they will accuse these people of as being what? Marxist. Okay, and accuse them of being Marxist. And you can read Marxism right here. Or they will say, well, they're just out there to create a war on America. How many times have you heard that? War on America. Folks, Marxists, who are Marxists? Marxists are people like Mao Zedong and such. The regimes were, and Stalin. We got tens of millions of people who died. I just don't think that's analogous to somebody who's proposing universal health care. I'm not sure how you make that leap, okay? Same thing with war in America. Really, that's a war? How is that a war? I don't know. I just think it's lazy, and I think it means that they don't have very much confidence in their argument when they just resort to this name calling. Similarly, people on the left, you'll get somebody that says, well, I'm a fiscal conservative, and I believe we ought to balance the budget. Okay, I believe we ought to spend our money wisely. And you have people on the left, and they'll be railing against this proposal of fiscal responsibility, and they'll be so upset, but nobody will listen to them because people go, well, yeah, you ought to be wise with how you spend taxpayer money. And what they have found is that nobody's going to listen to them unless they engage in extreme name calling, and they will start calling people Nazis. They will start calling conservatives, fiscal conservatives and such, Nazis, or racists, or supporters of Jim Crow. Folks, that's just out of line. If you cannot win an argument without engaging in this name calling, this hyperbolic name calling, then maybe you need to rework your argument. Okay? Just simply calling somebody a Marxist or calling somebody a Nazi is really not winning an argument. Okay? That's not an intellectual approach. It's just name calling. By the way, for those of you that don't know, I felt it was appropriate to put this here since this is a YouTube video on the science of stand-up. Do you know where Jim Crow laws originated? Do you know where the name originated, Jim Crow? Well, Jim Crow was a black caricature act performed by Thomas Rice. Now, Thomas Rice was a white song and dance man. Now, I want you to remember this. A white song and dance man who performed routines in blackface and was internationally acclaimed. I read some of his reviews on the internet. People thought he was amazing. I don't think his reviews would be quite as good today. Well, ultimately, this caricature, this Jim Crow, became a pejorative for blacks. And this Thomas Rice, who originated this Jim Crow, died with alcoholism and also died with an uncertain type of paralysis affecting his speech and legs. You talk about karma. Here's a white song and dance man who performed routines in blackface, and he died of paralysis affecting his speech and legs. He stated, after he died, he stated that his occupation should be listed as a comedian. And apparently he's buried somewhere under some tombstone that you can barely read in Brooklyn, New York. Okay, so when we start talking about Marxists and we start talking about Nazis and such, what are we really talking about? What we're really talking about are atrocities that occurred in other countries. And by the way, for all the people out there that always want to focus on the negatives of the United States, we have plenty of negatives. I'll concede that. Okay? But where else are you going to go? Where else on this planet are you going to go where the history of the country is just crystal clear? Okay? It's just pristine. I'm not saying people shouldn't protest and shouldn't expect better from the United States. I think we should expect better. We should always expect better. But at the same time, I think there needs to be some perspective. Like, where else are you going to go where there isn't some sort of history of atrocities? So again, let's look at this whole issue of Marxism and Nazism and such. So here's World War II. Here we had deaths in World War II by country. United Kingdom, over 450,000 deaths. United States, over 400,000 deaths. Japan, over 3 million deaths. China, over 20 million deaths. Germany had over 8 million deaths. And Russia had over 24 million deaths. If you want to know more about this from a comedic sense, Eddie Izzard kind of covered this a bit in his Dressed to Kill comedy concert that I had recommended in one of the earlier YouTube videos on the science of stand-up. My point is this. If you have somebody on the right who says, I'm a fiscal conservative, and if you have somebody on the left that says, I think everybody ought to be able to get health care without bankrupting them for the rest of their lives, I just don't know why it's necessary to refer to them as either Nazis or Marxists. Okay, this is Nazism and Marxism. This is the consequence right here on this slide. I just don't think that's the same as before. You might say, well, wait a minute, you're being pretty selective there, just going to World War II. And and such. All right, well, let's look at the kill count of dictators beyond World War II. Forget about Hitler and Stalin and Tojo there from Japan and such. Let's look at other dictators. And folks, look at the bottom here. From the 1500s to the 1800s, the American slave trade resulted in the death of about 2 million blacks. The Atlantic slave trade, which is, again, above and beyond just America, 4 to 5 million deaths. So many millions of deaths of blacks. That was in the 1500s and the 1800s. But even within just the past 100 years, look at how many people have died under dictators and such. I mean, I think no matter where you go in this world, a conclusion you might reach is human beings are just bloodthirsty bastards. I mean, look at this. Mao Zedong of China, it's been estimated 78 million deaths. Leopold of Belgium, 15 million deaths. Ismail Pasha of Turkey, 2.5 million deaths. Pol Pot of Cambodia, 2.0 million deaths. Folks, I've been to Asia. I've been to Asia several times. Nicest people ever, okay? But looking at this, I can't say that the history of Asia has always been a pristine one or always a peaceful one. There's been a lot of deaths that have happened in Asia, as is Europe, as in a lot of other places. You might want to say, well, the last one here, Kim Sung of North Korea, 1.5 million deaths. You might want to say, well, what about African nations? Hate to rain on your parade, folks, but in African nations, there have been millions of deaths due to dictatorships in those countries as well. So I just think we need to be careful and we need to have a perspective. Okay, so with this as a backdrop, what are the options when we encounter a problem? What are the options? Well, that's one thing that's it's always great about stand-up comedy is you can propose simple solutions. Now, many times they're ridiculous or whatever, but we play on that. Stand-up comics play on simple solutions or play on people who focus more on the problem than they do the solutions. That's many times is the essence of stand-up, at least from a socio-political standpoint. So what do we need to know when a problem arises? Well, one approach is to simply solve the problem. But there are a lot of pitfalls with that because it's time-consuming, it's challenging. You probably don't get very much self-recognition. And then if you were to fix 90% of the problem, you know what's going to happen. People are going to be critical of the 10% you didn't fix. And then the press will blow it out completely out of proportion, and the politicians will exploit it, and then you will be deemed a failure because you only fixed 90% of the problem. Right now, there are people out there that are fixing problems, and they're getting no recognition. You probably never heard of them. They're faceless because they're just doing what's right. They're doing good works. You're never going to hear about them. Second option, if a problem arises, what are you going to do about it? Well, you could just ignore the problem. And a lot of positives there. You don't have to spend the resources to solve the problem. It's not especially challenging. And then you don't have to worry about owning the solution, right? Because you didn't care. You just ignored it. Another option is you could just talk about the problem. Now, there are advantages to talking about problems because you get immediate gratification. It's not particularly challenging just to talk about problems. People look at you as you're just amazing because you want to take on this. You want to take on this problem. You want to speak out against this problem, so you get self-recognition. And you don't have to be accountable for the solutions. So talking about the problem is that's why there's so many people that talk about problems, because there's a lot of upside, not very many downsides. Similarly, you could respond with violence or symbolic acts or name calling or canceling, knocking over statues or renaming things. Again, immediate gratification, not especially challenging. You get self-recognized. And you don't have to consider the downsides of actually having to solve the problem, right? So I think if you look at this list, I don't think it's a mystery as to why so much of our time is spent either ignoring the problem or talking about the problem or engaged in symbolic acts, and so little of our time seems to be in actually fixing the problem. So how do we get away from this? Well, the first thing is recognize people's motivations for fixing problems. Sometimes people genuinely want to improve the lives of others, and that's just fabulous. And there are a lot of good people out there. Other businesses may want to solve problems because it's good public relations, or maybe it's in their best business interests. Great. Some people want to solve problems because it's free publicity, or maybe they feel better about themselves, or maybe they just want to get it off their desk. They just don't want to fool with it anymore, so they want to fix the problem. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, it's the box on the left we really want to cultivate. I may have a disagreement there. My sense of it is any of these are fine with me, as long as you want to fix the problem, as long as you're willing to roll up your sleeves, okay, stand shoulder to shoulder and fix the problem. I don't really much care what your motivation is, whether it's self-interest or interest in helping others. Fix the problem. Well, if we're going to fix the problem, who's going to fix the problem? Because that's the next big question. Well, it could be individuals within the private sector, or organizations like advocacy groups. Could be businesses. What about the government and the politicians and the press? So who among these would be in the best position to fix our nation's problems? What about the government? Okay, what about the government? So here's the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln, 1863. We are engaged in a great civil war. So he's standing on the battlefield, and they're in Gettysburg. He's looking over the war area, and we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We highly resolve that these dead, okay, he's looking at dead folks during the Civil War, that died during the Civil War, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. That's in 1863. That's Abraham Lincoln. Well, how long did that sentiment last? Okay? Because Rutherford B. Hayes, 1881, less than 20 years later, another U.S. president said, folks, I've had enough of this stuff. All laws on corporations, on taxation, on trust, wills, dissent, and the like need examination and extensive change. They're just all a mess. This is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people no longer. It's no longer for the people. It's a government of corporations, by corporations, and for corporations. And that was in 1881. So we've continued to have government since 1881. How many folks out there believe that the government we have now is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people? Well, as you're dwelling on your personal opinion, how about some actual data? Well, here is an analysis done in 2014. Here's the conclusion. Let me just cut to the chase here. When the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, in other words, once you take that away, the preferences of the average American appears to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. Wow. Okay, so once you account for the economic elites, corporations, organized interest groups and such, what is the impact that the average American voter has upon public policy? And the conclusion of this analysis in 2014 was the influence or the preferences of the American voter appears to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. Now, I know there are a lot of folks out there that are saying they believe they can change this, and I admire them and I applaud them for their efforts. They want to get away from all this, the way that voting districts have been drawn in order to protect the vast majority of the incumbents and such. And I applaud their efforts. It's just that, folks, this has been going on for over 150 years. And I just don't know that it's going to change. So I don't know that government can be a viable solution to many of the problems that we have in this country. You might say, what about the press? What about the press? Well, the problem with the press is that I don't know the rules. I can't find a rule book when it comes to the press. And that's important because I find I play better when I know the rules. A lot of people don't trust the press. It's because many people feel that the press is agenda-driven or narrative-driven. In other words, if there's a story that pops up, if it isn't relevant to the current narrative or what's otherwise going on in the country at the time, it may be ignored. And then there are instances of gotcha journalism. People don't like that. This inconsistent introduction of individuals who are accused of wrongdoing. Like you got some, let's say, for example, there's some sort of left-wing progressive who has been accused or convicted of something. There are certain news organizations that will say, well, the progressive senator from some northeastern state did this thing. And on the flip side, it's true as well. Many times if a Republican is convicted or accused of some horrible thing, there are a lot of left-wing members of the press who will start up when they write their story, well, the conservative Republican from the state of whatever was accused or convicted of this thing. I just wish people would be consistent. I don't know the rules. I wish that the press across the board would be consistent as to when they're going to label somebody a progressive or a liberal or a conservative when they report things about them in the news. And then we hear about selective edits of people or fabricated stories, sometimes just completely fabricated. And then the whole issue of fake news and fact checkers. The issue I have with fact checkers, I think it's good to have people who fact check things that people say, and I think that's a good idea, but who's checking the fact checkers? Like, where do I go to find an objective, bipartisan assessment as to which fact checkers are really objective? I don't know where to go, so I don't know who to believe, right? And why is it that fact checkers are only required during certain administrations but not others? Folks, I think if you're a news organization and you only get fact checkers when there's a particular administration in power that does not align with your ideology, that's not consistent, and I don't know the rules. And then, of course, there's the lack of diversity, oftentimes in the press, and I don't mean just race or sex or gender, or ethnicity or demographics or whatever. Sometimes I just don't think there's enough diversity in thought. And then there are other things that, again, I find I play better when I know the rules. And when things like this arise, I don't know what the rules are, and it makes it very challenging to know how to interpret press coverage. Here's one. The facts may be false, but the story is true. Not even going to comment on that. Okay? I think we all knew where that came from. I have a problem with it. Sorry. Again, I find I play better when I know the rules. Hard to come up with a rule when you have people saying things like that. Then there's this debate. Should we be capitalizing the first letter of black, Hispanic, and white? Fortunately, the American Medical Association says yes, we should be capitalizing all those. At least the time that's writing, I'm not sure the Associated Press agrees. I think they think that you should be capitalizing black and Hispanic, but not white. That just seems needlessly divisive to me. But maybe I don't know enough about it. I don't know. The other problem I have, due to a lack of consistency, is that many times if somebody is accused of a crime, how do they determine whether or not to put whether the person's race when they're describing the suspect, right? So a white man was accused of doing this, or a black man was accused of doing that, or a Hispanic man was accused of doing the other thing. How do they decide when or if to put race before the individual? Well, the Associated Press does have some guidance on that, so I think that's really good. But I don't know that everybody follows that guidance. I've heard some news organizations that say, well, if a white person commits a crime or whatever, we will put a white person there. But if a person of color does it, then we're not going to put there because we don't want to perpetuate a stereotype. And I understand that the heart's in the right place, and I get that. But what ends up happening is readers, when they read that somebody's been accused of a crime, and the race is not put before the person who's accused of a crime, then the assumption is it's a person of color. So it seems to me that what has essentially been accomplished by inconsistent reporting is that many people in these press organizations have codified the very stereotypes they hope to avoid. So yet again, I find I play better when I know the rules. What are the rules? Find the rules, adhere to them, move forward. Here's a similar filtering, the filtering gymnastics we all go through when we're trying to determine the accuracy of news. If there's a right-leaning person who gets accused of some sort of wrongdoing, how many of you do this? You'll go to a right-wing news source, and if they're on the guy, if they say, yeah, shouldn't have done that, okay, that was wrong, then the accusation is probably true. On the other hand, if it's a right-leaning person and you pick up a left-leaning news source, they just start railing against the guy. I mean, all you have to do is read the first paragraph. You know what the rest of the story is going to be. You don't have to read that. You might want to read the comments, but you're not going to waste your time reading the rest of the article because these folks are already biased. So in that case, it's possibly true. And it's the same thing with if there's a left-leaning person who's accused of doing something. If they're being criticized from left-leaning news sources, well, then it's probably true. I mean, you got to wait until you see all the facts. But if they get criticized from the right, some right-leaning news source, then you don't know if it's true or not. So again, it's this inconsistency and lack of objectivity where we have to go through these filtering gymnastics in order to get the story. Which is why, if we're going to figure out how to solve problems, we need to move more towards evidence-based solutions and less towards ad hominem attacks. Okay? More solutions based upon facts and less solutions based upon name-calling. So how are we going to do this? Well, let's just commit to systemic solutions. Unfortunately, there's other people that say, well, here's how I want to solve something. I just want to throw money at it, gets it off my desk. Or I'm going to symbolically fire or cancel somebody. Folks, that's not good. Because the overriding theme is this. Solutions are easy. It's the implementation of solutions that are hard. And I get that. And that's the reason I think applying the scientific method to problem solving can really help out. We just have agreed upon metrics by academics and stakeholder organizations. And then we determine whether these different sorts of solutions, whether they're effective or not, based upon objective metrics. And then once we have a series of solutions that are proven to have worked, we ask that the press, the media, and voters demand evidence-based solutions. But even if we did have evidence-based solutions, the challenge here would be people would object. Many people oppose metrics. They don't want to be assessed. Hey, our research site's undergone 2 Food and Drug Administration audits. Okay? Can't say I enjoyed the experience. Fact is, we actually ended up learning a lot. But I get it. Nobody wants to have an objective assessment of their work if they don't have to. There are also resistance to willingness to change. And then, of course, there's the politics. So I understand there's a lot of challenges with implementing evidence-based solutions. And here's one. And again, this is what the comics stand-ups would have a ball with, but you know it's coming. You just know there'd be some people out there that are still going to have problems. Okay, and this would be just ripe for material for stand-up comics. Okay, because the hypocrisy would just be unmatched. If we had an entire bank, okay, an entire bank of solutions to many of our societal problems, and people went to the stakeholders and said, okay, look, the changes we propose will immediately improve our educational system. They're going to improve learning, improve discipline, reduce truancy, increase teacher pay. And if we lived in an age where people accepted that evidence-based solutions were things that need to be implemented, can you imagine the turmoil for those people who resist change? I mean, you know exactly what would happen. They would go, look, we love your plan. You know, they'd have to give in, and they, to some extent, and they'd say, well, we love your plan. We love the improved learning and the improved discipline and the reduced truancy and the increase in teacher pay. We really love that. There's one little tweak we would make. We love everything about your plan. I want to congratulate you on your plan. One little tweak, and that would be, we just would prefer not to change anything. Okay? So if you could just run your proposal without changing anything and have all these other things take place, we would be fine with that. So what's the point? The point is, I think it's time for a new age. And that's what I've been gravitating towards. And I think that's what the Science of Stand-Up tells us. We're ready for an entirely new age. Now, what historians have done is they've taken time, years in the past, and they've ascribed these ages. So there's prehistory and ancient history and antiquity and Middle Ages, or sometimes called the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, modern history, contemporary history. What I'm suggesting is starting from year 2030 and beyond, the safe age. Now, let me be clear. Right now, we're in not such a good age. I don't think we are. But look, we've been there before. I mean, when people talk about the Dark Ages, they're talking when we had plague and dragons, fire-breathing dragons and such. But hey, look, what else was going on? It wasn't all dark. I mean, sometimes there's the dark before the sunrise, or whatever the expression is. A lot of things were going on during the Dark Ages that helped promote all the good things that we saw during the Renaissance. For example, things that, people that were around or things that were happening during the Dark Ages included Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Martin Luther, William Shakespeare, printing presses. So what exactly is the safe age that could start in 2030, that I'm proposing start in 2030? Well, it's an acronym, and S stands for Standards and Solutions. We're going to set standards. We'll all know the rules, all play by the same rules. And we're going to focus on solutions and not so much name calling. Now, I know that'll cause people's ears to bleed, but folks, I think it's got to happen. A, in SAFE, A, accountability and accurate assessment. For all you cancel culture folks out there that believe you're doing that, believe that cancellation of certain individuals is just simply accountability, there we go. Accountability is recognized, critical component of the safe age. F, freedom and forgiveness. Folks, we got to focus on freedom. People got to be able to express themselves as long as they're not hurting other people. We got to honor that. That's what our country was founded upon. And one of the biggest things for which I think we ought to have freedom is the freedom of forgiveness. The next YouTube video is dedicated towards a proposal, a systematic proposal of forgiveness. Because I think it is ridiculous now that we have people that are being fired from their jobs or have their careers harmed or their profession, their professional life decimated. I just don't think that's where we need to be. There's got to be an opportunity that if you said or did something for which you regret, we ought to think about the possibility of forgiveness. We're going to talk about that. And finally, evidence and empathy. That's the E. Evidence. We need to have evidence-based solutions. And we need to consider that during the entire time when we're focused on standards and solutions and accountability and accurate assessment and freedom and forgiveness and evidence, all of those things sound great, but it's likely some people are going to be left behind as we enter into this new age. And we need to be empathetic to that and figure out ways to carry everyone with us. So in summary, what I would say is we do have problems. Stand-up comedy is a way to, in a way to illustrate these problems. And in some ways, maybe suggest some solutions, which many times are actually pretty simple, although they're complicated to implement. And I believe that these solutions are probably going to have to arise from individuals within the private sector, organizations like academicians and advocacy groups, and business. I don't know that the government and the press is going to be very helpful because I don't know how helpful they've been in the past. Finally, let me conclude with this. When it comes to cancel culture, yes, I am opposed to cancel culture in the way that it is conducted many times. I mean, if you look at, and we've discussed this before, the top 10 characteristics of offendophilia, here they are listed. You can read them. But the main one I want to focus upon is the last one. The main criteria: a remarkable desire and ability to suppress or cancel or hurt others. That's where I think you've crossed the line. When you start canceling other people because you simply disagree with their point of view, I think you have crossed a line. And that isn't just me speaking. Here are quotes from Barack Obama. Obama has criticized what he in 2019 called woke culture that leaves little room for forgiveness and misdeeds of people in public life. Again, got a whole section on forgiveness in the next YouTube video. This idea of purity, and you're always politically woke and all that stuff, you need to get over that quickly. The world is messy. There are ambiguities. People who do really good stuff have flaws. We all do, folks. And finally, the last quote in this slide here: calling out others on social media is not activism. It's not solving problems. It may make you feel better, not solving the problem. And at least me, from a personal standpoint, I wouldn't even know how to begin to think about which people need to be canceled or not. I mean, I don't know what's going on in people's hearts. I mean, how would I know that? At our research site, we have dual X-ray absorptiometry called DEXA. We have transient elastography looking for fat in the liver. We have all kinds of devices. We measure vital signs and those types of things. I don't have a soulometer. I don't know what's in people's souls. I don't know. I don't have that device. I don't know how to do that. And so I just don't think I'm in a position to think about the best way to ruin a person's career or to have them fired or whatever, simply because I do not agree with their particular point of view. So as I mentioned before, I understand there's people that are trying to do this by working through the government, and I applaud these people and whatever. But that's just not proven to be effective. It certainly isn't effective now in the 2020s. I don't think that it is. Because current voter choice is, how many people are focused on who best can fix the problem? Not many. And since nobody's really fixing the problem, people just vote who's on their team, who has their ideology. I think we've given up on voting people based upon their ability to fix things. And I would like to see that change. I mean, what would happen if politicians came to understand that elections or re-elections, it was dependent upon vertical rather than longitudinal voting? In other words, I wonder if politicians began to realize their chances of being elected or re-elected depended upon evidence-based solutions and not necessarily the team. But right now, as I said, we vote left team, right team. What I'd like to see is us to flip it, from X voting to Y voting, and start voting for people based upon their ability to solve problems versus those people who have no interest in solving problems. Now, I know some of you say is, well, I'd be happy to do that, but the other side, they're dastardly human beings, and they would continue to vote for ideology, and I would vote for solutions, and then my team would lose, and that's the only thing that would happen. I get it, folks. So maybe what it's going to take is for a non-Republican or non-Democrat to win a presidential election based upon a commitment to problem solving. And I think if something like that were to happen, it would send shockwaves. Maybe we can enter in the safe age. So this is yet another installment or another YouTube video of the Science of Stand-Up. The next one will be on forgiveness, and that will complete the 3 YouTube videos on social sciences. The first being racism, the second being free speech and cancel culture, and then the third one being forgiveness. Click on the subscribe button to add this channel to your subscriptions. Click on the notification bell so you will be alerted to new content. If you like this video, click on the like button. If you would like to share this through email or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, click on the share button. And as with the other YouTube videos, here are the questions for which I would appreciate you commenting upon in the comment section. To what degree are your actions aligned with the statement, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it"? As I said, folks, when I was growing up, I heard this quote all the time. Don't hear it so much anymore. Number 2, if being tolerant is defined as respecting those who are different, then how accepting are you of those with ideas and speech that you disagree or dislike? Which rights concern you the most, the rights of the accuser or the rights of the accused? Could you support an evidence-based solution if it were bipartisan? And here is a question, and I want to put this in the Guinness Book of World Records because it's a statement. I believe I've come up with a statement that is the only statement ever written that both people on the far right and the far left would agree. To my knowledge, it's the only statement ever written for which both extremes could absolutely agree. The problem with the other side is they believe in fake news, they are intolerant to the viewpoints of others, and they promote hate and violence. Again, I think people on the far right and far left would both agree with this statement. So thank you again. Again, my name is Dr. Harold Bays, and this has been yet another YouTube video on the Science Stand-Up.